Every man has a moment when pride costs him everything. Some learn this lesson through lost love, others through failed business, but a few discover it staring into the eyes of a caged killer. In the dusty streets of Amarillo, Texas, 1885, a traveling trader rolls into town with something the frontier has never seen: a black panther, wild and deadly, locked behind iron bars. The townsfolk gather, mesmerized and terrified. When the bidding starts, fear keeps wallets closed. Then wealthy rancher Samuel Morrison steps forward, slaps down $1 silver, and says 5 words that will change his life forever: "I'll take the dangerous one." But what happens when a man who believes money can buy anything meets a creature that refuses to be owned? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Morrison pulled the brass pocket watch from his vest and checked the time against the setting sun. 6:15, just as the long shadows told him. The watch had belonged to his father, then his grandfather before that, its case worn smooth by 3 generations of calloused thumbs. Inside the front cover, an inscription read, "Time shows a man what he's made of." Samuel had never quite understood what the old man meant by that, but he carried it anyway, more out of habit than sentiment. The Morrison Ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of prime Texas grassland, bought and paid for with cattle money and smart investments in railroad stock. Samuel had inherited it all when he turned 25. The land, the house, the reputation, and the weight of living up to the Morrison name. That was 15 years ago, and in that time he doubled the ranch's size and tripled its worth. He'd done it through calculated risks that other men wouldn't take, deals that made his neighbors shake their heads and call him either brilliant or reckless, depending on how they turned out. The ranch house sat on a small rise overlooking the Palo Duro Creek, a 2-story structure built from local limestone with wide porches that caught the evening breeze. Margaret had insisted on the wraparound porch when they built the place 8 years ago, claiming a man needed somewhere to sit and think after a hard day's work. She'd been right about that, as she was about most things. Samuel often found himself there in the evenings, watching the cattle move across the pastures like dark clouds casting shadows on golden grass. Margaret Morrison was everything the frontier wives' tales said a good woman should be: strong enough to birth calves and gentle, enough to tend the sick, smart enough to keep the books, and wise enough to know when to speak her mind. She'd grown up on a neighboring ranch, the daughter of German immigrants who'd carved their place from the wilderness with nothing but determination and strong backs. When Samuel had asked for her hand, her father had studied him for a long moment before saying, "He'll do, but watch that pride of his, Margaret. Pride's killed more good men than bullets ever will." 7 years of marriage had taught her to read the signs. When Samuel's jaw set in that particular way, when his fingers drummed against his thigh, when he started checking that pocket watch more frequently, these were the warnings that he was about to do something that would either make them richer or put them all at risk. She'd learned to speak up during these moments, though she'd also learned that sometimes her words carried no more weight than morning mist against a coming storm. The foreman, Jake Patterson, had been with the Morrison family for 23 years, starting as a young cowhand when Samuel's father was still alive. He'd taught Samuel to ride, to rope, to read the weather and the mood of cattle. Jake was a man of few words but deep loyalty, the kind who would follow orders even when he disagreed with them, though his weathered face always told the truth of what he thought. He'd saved Samuel's life twice, once from a charging bull, once from a rattlesnake, and Samuel trusted him more than any other man alive. The town of Amarillo in 1885 was still rough around the edges, a place where the railroad met the cattle. Trails and civilization bumped up against the wild frontier. Main Street stretched 6 blocks, lined with wooden sidewalks and buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up quickly and might blow away just as fast. The Cattleman's Hotel stood At one end, a three-story structure that served as the unofficial headquarters for ranchers and railroad men. At the other end sat the train depot, where twice a week the eastbound train brought news, supplies and strangers from worlds most locals would never see. Samuel was known throughout Amarillo and the surrounding county as a man to be reckoned with. He paid his debts promptly, kept his word, and never backed down from a challenge. He'd won the county's first horse race, putting up $1,000 when most men wouldn't risk 50. He'd bought land that other ranchers called worthless, and found water that made it bloom. He'd stood up to cattle thieves and railroad bullies alike, earning the kind of reputation that made men step aside when he walked down the sidewalk. But with that reputation came expectations, and with expectations came the constant need to prove himself worthy of the Morrison name. His father had been a legend in these parts, the kind of man who could gentle a wild horse or face down a gang of rustlers with equal calm. Samuel felt that shadow every day, felt the eyes of older men measuring him against a memory that seemed to grow larger with each passing year. The ranch employed 16 full-time hands, men who knew cattle and horses and the harsh realities of frontier life. They respected Samuel because he worked alongside them, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. But they also whispered sometimes about his need to prove himself, about the bets he'd make and the risks he'd take that seemed to serve no purpose except to show he could. There was the time he'd ridden alone into Indian territory to retrieve stolen cattle, when the smart thing would have been to write them off as a loss. There was the poker game in Fort Worth where he'd bet the deed to a section of land on a pair of eights and somehow won. There was the winter he'd kept the entire herd on the range when every other rancher drove theirs to shelter, insisting he could read the weather better than the almanac. He'd been right that time, but Margaret still remembered the sleepless nights. The brass watch ticked steadily in his pocket as Samuel stood on his porch that evening, unaware that tomorrow would bring the greatest test of his pride yet. The sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its mate. Margaret stepped out onto the porch beside him, her presence as comfortable as an old coat. "You're thinking again," she said, not looking at him but out at the horizon where the last light was fading. "I can practically hear the gears turning." Samuel smiled despite himself. "Maybe I am. Jake says there's talk in town about a trader coming through with something unusual." "Unusual how?" "He wouldn't say exactly. Just that it's got the whole town talking." Margaret turned to study her husband's profile in the fading light. Something in his tone set off a familiar warning in her chest, the same feeling she'd had before the horse race, before the poker game, before every other time his pride had led him to the edge of a cliff. "Samuel Morrison," she said quietly, "whatever it is this trader has, I hope you'll think twice before you let your curiosity get the better of your judgment." Samuel pulled out the pocket watch and checked it against the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. 6:45. He thought about his grandfather's inscription, about time showing a man what he's made of, and wondered what tomorrow might reveal about him. "Don't worry, Margaret," he said, snapping the watch closed and putting his arm around his wife's shoulders. "I'm not planning to do anything foolish." But even as he said the words, he felt that familiar stirring in his chest, the same restless energy that had driven him to every risk and triumph of his adult life. Tomorrow, there would be something new in Amarillo, something that had captured the town's imagination, and Samuel Morrison would be there to see what all the fuss was about. The brass watch ticked steadily against his ribs, counting down the hours, until a single silver dollar would change everything. The wagon rolled into Amarillo just after noon, drawn by 4 exhausted mules and driven by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. What captured everyone's attention wasn't the driver, though, but what he carried in the wagon bed, a massive iron cage covered with heavy canvas that seemed to shift and move with something alive underneath. Word spread through town like a grass. Fire. By the time the stranger had parked his wagon in front of the cattleman's hotel, a crowd had gathered, keeping a respectful distance, but craning their necks for a better look. The driver was a thin man with nervous eyes and hands that never stopped moving, constantly adjusting his hat or checking the ropes that secured the canvas cover. "Name's Ezra Flint," he announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying the practiced tone of a man who made his living drawing attention. "And I've brought you something Amarillo's never seen before, something from the deepest jungles of Mexico, captured at great risk and tremendous expense." Samuel had been in the general store when he heard the commotion. Margaret had asked him to pick up supplies, but the moment he heard men calling to each other in the street, he abandoned the list and stepped outside. The crowd was already 3 deep around. Samuel caught it too now. The musky, predatory scent that spoke of something that had never known civilization, never been broken to man's will. The canvas covering shifted again, and this time there was a sound from within, low and rumbling, like distant thunder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Flint called out, climbing onto the wagon seat to address the crowd, "what you're about to see will either thrill you or terrify you, possibly both. Behind this canvas lies one of nature's most perfect killers, a black panther captured in the mountains of Mexico after it had killed 3 men who tried to take it." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people stepped back, while others pressed. Closer, Samuel found himself in the latter group, drawn by something he couldn't name. "Now I could take this magnificent beast to San Antonio or Houston, where the rich folks would pay handsomely for such a specimen. But I believe in giving honest frontier folk first chance at something extraordinary." Flint's eyes swept the crowd, lingering on the better-dressed men like Samuel. "The question is, who among you has the courage to own such a creature?" "What would a man do with a panther?" called out Doc Henderson, the town physician. "Why, the same thing he'd do with any other animal, Doc. Train it, tame it, show folks that man's will can master even the wildest beast. Think of the pride in owning something that no other man for 100 miles could handle." The word pride hit Samuel like a physical blow. He felt Margaret's warning from the night before, felt Jake's concerned glance, but stronger than either was the challenge implicit in Flint's words. The question wasn't whether someone would buy this panther. It was whether Samuel Morrison was man enough to be that someone. "Let's see this killer of yours," Samuel called out, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. Flint grinned, recognizing the tone of a potential buyer. "Stand back, folks. Give me room." The trader began untying the ropes that held the canvas in place. As each rope fell away, the tension in the crowd grew thicker. Finally, with a dramatic flourish, Flint pulled the canvas free. The iron cage was a masterwork of brutal functionality, built from bars as thick as a man's thumb and welded together with joints that looked like they could hold back hell itself. But it was what moved inside that stole every breath in the crowd. The Black Panther was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Nearly 7 feet from nose to tail, its coat was so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Yellow eyes, cold as winter stars, swept the crowd with intelligent malice. When it moved, muscles flowed beneath its skin like water. Speaking of power that could snap a man's neck as easily as breaking a twig. "Dear God," whispered someone behind Samuel. The panther's gaze found Samuel in the crowd and held. For a moment that lasted an eternity, man and beast studied each other across the iron bars. Samuel felt something he'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that he was looking at something that could kill him without effort or hesitation. Instead of fear, though, he felt excitement. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Flint said, his voice dropping to an almost reverent whisper. "Captured in the Sierra Madre by a team of 12 men. Cost me 8 of them before we got her in this cage. But look at that power, that grace. There's not another creature like her north of Mexico." "How much?" The words left Samuel's mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them. The crowd turned to stare at him. Jake's hand fell on his shoulder, a gentle warning, but Samuel shrugged it off. His eyes never left the panther, and hers never left his. Well now, Flint said, his grin widening. I was hoping for serious interest. This is no ordinary animal, Mr. Morrison. Samuel Morrison. Ah, the Morrison Ranch. I've heard good things. For a man of your standing, a creature like this, well, let's say $1,000 wouldn't be unreasonable. A gasp ran through the crowd. $1,000 was more than most men saw in 5 years. But Samuel barely heard the number. He was thinking about his father's watch, about time showing a man what he's made of, about the inscription that had never made sense until this moment. That's a lot of money for an animal, called out Fred Jameson, who owned the competing spread. To the west, it's a lot of money for a pet, Samuel replied, his voice steady. But we're not talking about a pet, are we? We're talking about something that's never been tamed, never been broken, something that would prove a man can master anything if he has the will for it. The panther moved to the front of the cage, pressing its face against the bars. Its yellow eyes remained fixed on Samuel, and he could swear he saw intelligence there, awareness of what was being discussed. When it opened its mouth slightly, revealing white fangs, the length of a man's finger, Samuel felt his heart race with anticipation rather than fear. "I'll give you $1, Samuel said. The crowd erupted in laughter. Even Flint looked confused. "Sir, I think you misunderstood. I heard you perfectly." Samuel reached into his pocket and withdrew a single silver dollar, the same one he'd carried for luck since his first cattle drive. "You said this panther has killed 3 men. You said it cost you 8 more to capture it. If it's as dangerous as you claim, then clearly no sane man should want it." He held up the silver dollar so it caught the afternoon light. "But I'm not interested in sane. I'll take the dangerous one." The laughter died away. Flint stared at the silver dollar, then at Samuel, then back at the dollar. The panther let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the iron bars and into every man's bones. "Mr. Morrison," Flint said slowly, "I don't think you understand what you're dealing with." "I understand perfectly. The question is whether you're a man of your word. You said you brought this creature to give honest frontier folk a chance at something extraordinary. Well, here's my offer. $1 for the dangerous one." Samuel stepped forward and placed the silver dollar on the wagon's tailgate. The simple action carried the weight of a thrown gauntlet. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the panther's breathing and the distant whistle of wind through the eaves of the hotel. Flint looked around at the crowd, seeing the challenge in their eyes. To refuse the silver dollar now would be to admit his creature wasn't as dangerous as advertised. To accept it would be to sell a killer for the price of a drink. After a long moment, Flint reached out and picked up the silver dollar. "Sold," he said, "but the cage comes with her. I won't be responsible for what happens when you try to move her without it." Samuel nodded, already planning how to transport the massive iron structure to his ranch. The crowd began to disperse, men shaking their heads and talking in low voices about Samuel Morrison's latest bout of madness. Jake stepped up beside him as they watched Flint hitch his mules to prepare for departure. "Samuel, what the hell have you done?" Samuel stared at the panther, which had retreated to the back of its cage, but continued to watch him with those unblinking yellow eyes. "I honestly don't know, Jake, but I guess we're about to find out." The brass pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, counting down the hours until Samuel Morrison would learn exactly what he was made of. Getting the panther to the ranch proved to be the first lesson in just how little Samuel understood what he'd bought. The iron cage weighed nearly as much as a small building, and moving it required a special wagon borrowed from the railroad, pulled by 8 horses and supervised by Jake and 4 of the strongest ranch hands. The panther remained silent during the journey, watching everything with those unsettling yellow eyes, but her presence seemed to spook every animal they passed. Horses shied, cattle scattered, and even the ranch dogs tucked their tails and disappeared the moment the wagon rolled into the yard. Margaret had been waiting on the porch when they arrived, her arms crossed and her face set in lines Samuel recognized as the calm before a storm. She said nothing as the men struggled to position the cage near the barn. Said nothing as Samuel directed them to reinforce the ground beneath it with timber supports. Said nothing until the last hired hand had left, and it was just the three. Of them, Samuel, Margaret, and the Panther. Have you lost your mind completely? Her voice was quiet, which made it more dangerous than shouting would have been. Samuel pulled off his work gloves and slapped the dust from them against his leg. The leather was already showing wear from handling the heavy ropes and chains they'd used to secure the cage. It's an investment, Margaret. Once I train her. Margaret's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Samuel, that's not a horse or a dog. That's a killer. Look at her. They both turned to stare at the Panther, which had positioned herself at the front of the cage, watching them with an intelligence that was almost human. When their eyes met hers, she didn't look away or show any sign of submission. If anything, her gaze seemed calculating, as if she was studying them for weaknesses. She's wild, I'll grant you that, Samuel said, but every animal can be broken if you know how. Broken? Jake spoke up from where he'd been checking the cage's securing chains. Samuel, my grandfather told me stories about cats like this. They're not like other animals. They're not meant to be owned by anyone. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. The doubt in their voices stung worse than any outright criticism would have. Your grandfather also thought lightning was God's anger, and bad luck came from spilled salt. This is 1885, Jake. A man with patience and proper methods can train any animal. Over the next 3 days, Samuel set about proving his theory. He'd read about animal training in books ordered from Chicago, had studied the methods used in circuses and Wild West shows. The key, according to the experts, was to establish dominance early and maintain it consistently. Never show fear, never back down, always let the animal know who was in charge. He started by simply approaching the cage, speaking in low, calm tones, letting the Panther get used to his presence. She watched him constantly, never relaxing, never seeming to sleep. When he moved closer to the bars, she would rise to her feet with fluid grace, every muscle tensed for action. When he backed away, she would settle again but never take her eyes off him. On the second day, he tried offering food, fresh beef from his own cattle, held on a long pole and pushed through the bars. The Panther ignored it completely. The meat sat untouched for hours, until finally Samuel had to remove it before it spoiled. She wasn't refusing the food out of fear or stress, he realized. She was refusing it because accepting it would acknowledge his authority over her. The third day brought his first real attempt at physical interaction. Wearing his thickest leather gloves and armed with a long cattle prod, Samuel opened the small, feeding door built into the side of the cage. His plan was simple: establish physical dominance by forcing the Panther to retreat to the back of the cage while he placed food inside. The moment his gloved hand crossed the threshold, the Panther struck. The attack lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Samuel found himself staring at razor-sharp claws extending through the feeding slot, and in that instant he understood that the only reason he still had a hand was because the Panther had chosen not to take it. The leather glove hung in tatters, shredded so completely it looked like it had been fed through a shredding machine. 4 parallel cuts traced across the back of his hand, not deep enough to be dangerous, but deep enough to draw blood and make his point crystal clear. Samuel stumbled backward, clutching his hand against his chest, his heart hammering like a woodpecker. The Panther had already settled back into her watching position, completely calm, as if the lightning-fast attack had required no more effort than swatting a fly. Jesus Christ, Jake breathed, running over with a clean bandana. Samuel, are you... I'm fine. Samuel's voice was rougher than he intended. He let Jake wrap the bandana around his torn knuckles while staring at the ruins of his glove on the ground. The leather had been good quality, thick enough to handle barbed wire and rough work. The Panther had destroyed it like it was made of paper. That evening, Margaret tended to his wounds with a mixture of iodine and silence that stung worse than the medicine. When she was finished, she sat back and studied his face. She could have taken your hand off, Margaret said finally, but she didn't. This time, Margaret began putting away her medical supplies, each movement precise and controlled. Samuel, I've stood by every crazy thing you've done since we've been married. The horse race, the poker game, that fool investment in the copper mine. But this is different. This isn't about money or pride or proving yourself. This is about something that wants to kill you. Samuel flexed his bandaged hand, testing the wounds. She's testing me, Margaret, seeing what I'm made of. It's natural behavior for a predator. And what happens when she decides you've failed her test? Before Samuel could answer, a sound drifted through the open window that made them both freeze. It was coming from the direction of the barn, a low vocalization that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a purr. It was a sound that spoke of patience and hunger and something else that Samuel couldn't quite identify, but that made his skin. "Oh, crawl, she's learning our patterns," Jake said from the kitchen doorway, where he'd been having coffee with the cook. "Watching when we come and go, when we sleep, when we're most vulnerable. That's what smart predators do." Margaret turned to her husband, and in her eyes, Samuel saw something he'd never seen before. Genuine fear, not for herself, but for him. "Promise me something, Samuel. Promise me you won't try to handle her alone anymore. Whatever you do with that creature, make sure Jake or the other men are there to help if something goes wrong." Samuel nodded, though he was already thinking about tomorrow's training session, about different approaches he might try. The torn gloves lay on the kitchen table between them, leather strips curled like accusatory fingers. Outside, the Panther's voice rose and fell in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing, as if the creature was tasting the night air and finding it full of interesting possibilities. The brass pocket watch ticked steadily from his vest pocket, hung on a chair by the door. Time was indeed showing Samuel Morrison what he was made of, though the revelation was proving more complicated than he'd expected. The Panther's first escape attempt came on a Tuesday morning when the autumn air carried the scent of coming winter. Samuel had been in the barn checking on a mare with a stone bruise when Jake's shout cut through the morning calm like a cavalry bugle. "The cage! Samuel, get out here!" Samuel dropped the mare's hoof and ran outside to find Jake standing 20 feet from the Panther's enclosure, his face pale as whitewash. The massive iron cage sat exactly where they'd placed it a week ago, but something was wrong. The heavy door, secured with 3 separate locks and a chain, hung open like a mouth caught mid-scream. The Panther sat calmly inside the cage, watching them with what Samuel could only describe as amusement. She hadn't left. She could have. The door had been open wide enough for her to walk through, but she'd chosen to stay. The message was unmistakable. She could leave whenever she wanted, and their locks and chains were nothing more than suggestions she might or might not choose to honor. "How in hell," Samuel began, then stopped. The locks lay on the ground beside the cage, still fastened. The chain hung from the doorframe, unbroken, but somehow, impossibly, the door had been opened. Jake walked closer, his movements careful and deliberate. "Samuel, look at this." The fence post that had supported one corner of the additional barrier they'd built around the cage was snapped in half. The wood splintered, as if something incredibly strong had twisted it like a wet branch. But it wasn't broken outward, as it would be if the Panther had charged against it. It was broken inward, deliberately, systematically weakened until it gave way. "She's been working on this for days," Jake said quietly, "testing it, finding the weak point, figuring out exactly how much pressure to apply and where." He looked up at Samuel with troubled eyes. "Samuel, this isn't animal behavior. This is planning." Samuel stared at the broken fence post, his mind racing. The Panther had somehow manipulated the locks without breaking them, had weakened their barriers without making enough noise to alert anyone, had planned and executed an escape route, and then had chosen not to use it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She was toying with them. Word of the escape attempt spread through Amarillo faster than news of a gold strike. By afternoon, a delegation of concerned citizens had arrived at the ranch, led by Mayor Hutchins and including several of Samuel's neighbors. They found him and Jake reinforcing the cage with additional bars and heavier chains, sweating despite the cool weather. "Samuel," Mayor Hutchins called out, staying well back from the enclosure. "We need to talk." The conversation took place on the front porch, where Margaret served coffee and tried to maintain the polite fiction that this was a social call. But the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone knew why they'd come. "The thing is, Samuel," said Tom Brennan, whose ranch bordered the Morrison spread to the north, "folks in town are getting nervous. An animal that can get out of its cage, well, that's a danger to everyone in the county." "She didn't get out," Samuel replied, his voice steady. "She's still in the cage." "But she could have," Mayor Hutchins interjected. "And what happens next time? What happens when she decides not to stay put?" Fred Jameson, Samuel's longtime rival, leaned forward in his chair. "I've got cattle grazing within 2 miles of here. If that thing gets loose and kills my stock, I'll be looking to you for compensation. And I've got children who walk to school past your eastern pasture," added Dr. Henderson. "What am I supposed to tell their parents? That it's probably safe?" Samuel felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had before every major challenge of his adult life. But this time it was mixed with something else. Doubt. Not about his ability to handle the Panther, but about whether he should have to justify his choices to men who'd never taken a risk greater than betting 2 bits on a poker hand. "Gentlemen," Samuel said carefully, "I appreciate your concerns, but this is my land and my responsibility. I'll handle the situation." "How?" The question came from Margaret, and it caught Samuel off guard. His wife rarely spoke during these kinds of meetings, preferring to let the men hash things out among themselves, but her voice carried a weight that made everyone turn to look at her. "How will you handle it, Samuel? Because so far, your handling has consisted of getting your hand torn up and watching that creature prove she can escape whenever she wants." Samuel stared at his wife, feeling betrayed. In all their years of marriage, Margaret had never contradicted him in front of other people. She might argue with him privately, might express her concerns in the safety of their bedroom, but she'd always presented a united front when outsiders were involved. "Margaret," he said quietly, "this isn't the time." "When is the time, Samuel? When she actually gets out? When someone gets killed?" Margaret set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "These men have legitimate concerns, and they deserve honest answers." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the Panther, moving in her cage, a soft scratching that might have been claws against iron or might have been something else entirely. Jake cleared his throat. "If I may say something," he looked around the porch, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "I've worked animals my whole life. Horses, cattle, even helped break a few wild mustangs back in my younger days. But this Panther, she's different. She thinks. She plans. She's not trying to escape because she's scared or desperate. She's doing it because she wants us to know she can." "What are you saying, Jake?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew. "I'm saying she's not trying to get away from us, Samuel. She's studying us, learning our habits, our weaknesses, our routines, and I think she's got something in mind beyond just getting loose." That evening, after the delegation had left with vague promises to monitor the situation, Samuel found himself alone with Margaret in their bedroom. She was brushing her hair at the vanity, her movements sharp and angry. "You undermine me today," Samuel said. Margaret's hand stilled for a moment, then resumed its motion. "I spoke the truth, in front of men who were already looking for reasons to doubt me. Maybe they should doubt you, Samuel. Maybe I should doubt you." She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Do you know what Jake told me yesterday? He said he's been watching that Panther, and she's been watching our bedroom window. She knows which room we sleep in, Samuel. She knows our schedule, when we go to bed, when we wake up." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn. air seeping through the walls. Jake's imagination is getting the better of him, is it? Or are you so determined to prove you can tame this creature that you're willing to risk all our lives? Margaret stood up, crossing to the window and pulling the curtain aside to look out at the barn. I can see her from here, Samuel. Even in the dark, I can see those yellow eyes watching our house. Samuel joined her at the window, and sure enough, there was the faint gleam of the panther's eyes in the darkness, steady and unwavering, pointed directly at their bedroom. She's just curious, Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Samuel Morrison, Margaret said quietly, I've stood by you through every foolish thing you've ever done, but I won't stand by and watch you get yourself killed for pride. And I won't risk my own life for your need to prove something to a bunch of men who'll forget all about this the moment you're in the ground. She turned away from the window and began pulling clothes from the wardrobe. What are you doing? Packing. I'm going to stay with my sister in town until you come to your senses and get rid of that creature. Margaret, please. No, Samuel, not this time. She folded a dress with unnecessary precision, her movements controlled, but her voice shaking. You bought that panther with a silver dollar, but you're paying for it with our marriage, and the price is too high. Outside, as if she'd heard every word, the panther let out a low call that seemed to carry both mockery and invitation. The broken fence post lay in the darkness beside her cage, a reminder that some barriers were only as strong as the will to respect them. Samuel stood at the window long after Margaret had finished packing, staring out at the yellow eyes that never seemed to blink, never seemed to look away. For the first time since he'd made his fateful purchase, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd bought something that couldn't be owned by any man. Samuel's first serious injury came 3 days after Margaret left for town, when his judgment was clouded by loneliness and his pride wounded by her absence. He'd been drinking, not heavily, but enough to dull the sharp edge of caution that had kept him alive through 40 years of frontier life. The plan had been simple: demonstrate his authority by cleaning the panther's cage while she was inside, it proving to himself and anyone watching that he was master of the situation. Jake had objected, of course. Samuel, wait until morning when your head's clear, or at least let me get the boys to help. But Samuel was tired of waiting, tired of caution, tired of the yellow eyes that watched him from the cage and seemed to mock his every attempt at dominance. I can handle one animal, Jake. I don't need an audience. The mistake came when Samuel opened the cage door wider than necessary, confident that the long-handled cleaning tool would keep him safely out of reach. The panther moved with the fluid speed of spilled mercury, not to attack directly, but to position herself between Samuel and the exit. In that instant, Samuel realized he was trapped inside the cage with a killer, and all his theories about animal training seemed as substantial as morning mist. The panther didn't charge. She simply stood there, blocking his escape, her yellow eyes fixed on his with an intelligence that was almost conversational. The message was clear. Now you're in my territory, on my terms. Samuel backed against the far bars, the cleaning tool, clutched in hands that had begun to shake. Easy, girl, he whispered, though his voice cracked on the words. Easy now. The panther tilted her head as if considering his words, then took a single step forward. The movement was casual, unhurried, but it closed the distance between them to something measurably dangerous. Samuel could see every detail of her now, the way her muscles coiled beneath that midnight coat, the white tips of her fangs showing past black lips, the complete absence of fear or uncertainty in her posture. When she struck, it wasn't with the wild fury he'd expected, but with surgical precision. Her paw caught his forearm just below the elbow, claws extending just enough to tear through his sleeve and the flesh beneath. The force of the blow sent him sprawling against the cage wall, his arm burning with pain and his shirt suddenly warm with blood. Jake found him 20 minutes later, sitting on the ground inside the cage, while the panther watched from her corner with what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. The ranch hands had to use ropes and noisemakers to drive her back far enough for them to drag Samuel out, and even then, she showed no real urgency about retreating. Doc Henderson stitched the wounds by lamplight in the ranch house kitchen, his weathered hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. 12 stitches, he pronounced, wiping blood from his fingers. Could have been worse, should have been worse from the look of these claw marks. She held back Samuel. That's what's troubling me. Samuel stared at the white bandana wrapped around his forearm, already spotted with seeping blood. What do you mean? I mean those claws could have gone twice as deep without any more effort on her part. She could have severed tendons, broken bones, opened arteries. Instead, she gave you exactly the lesson she wanted to give. No more, no less. Doc Henderson packed his medical bag with the efficient movements of a man who'd sewn up everything. From gunshot wounds to farming accidents. That's not animal behavior, Samuel. That's intelligence. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Professor Edmund Cartwright from the University of Texas, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the soft hands of someone who'd spent his life with books rather than cattle. He'd heard about Samuel's Panther through academic circles and had traveled from Austin to see the creature for himself. Magnificent specimen, Cartwright murmured, studying the panther from a safe distance. Melanistic leopard, most likely from the mountains of Sonora. Extraordinarily rare this far north. Can it be trained? Samuel asked, though his bandaged arm throbbed with the obvious answer. Cartwright adjusted his spectacles and considered the question with academic precision. Mr. Morrison, I've studied animal behavior for 20 years, worked with circus trainers and zoological experts across the country. What you have there isn't just a wild animal. It's an apex predator with cognitive abilities that rival the great apes. The question isn't whether it can be trained, but whether any human being could survive the training process. Men have tamed mountain lions before. Mountain lions, yes. Even the occasional jaguar. But this, Cartwright gestured toward the cage where the panther lay, watching them with unblinking attention. This is something different. Look at her eyes, Mr. Morrison. She's not reacting to us. She's evaluating us, planning. I've seen that look in exactly one other place, the mirror. That afternoon brought news that turned Samuel's private struggle into a public crisis. 3 of Tom Brennan's prize cattle had been found dead in the north pasture, killed with the surgical precision that spoke of a large cat. The tracks around the carcasses were unclear. The ground was too hard from the dry weather, but the method of the kill left little doubt about what had done it. Impossible, Samuel insisted when Jake brought the news. She's been in her cage. The whole time. We've had men watching her around the clock. Have we? Jake's voice was carefully neutral. Because Billy Martinez swears he fell asleep for maybe an hour during his watch last night, and Pete Kowalski admits he stepped away to answer nature's call around midnight. Samuel stared at his foreman, understanding the implications. You think she got out again? I think she's been getting out whenever she wants, Samuel. I think our watches and locks and chains are just for show, and she's been coming and going as it pleases her. Jake glanced toward the cage, where the panther lay in her usual position, seemingly asleep but with ears that tracked every sound. The question is, what's she planning to do next? The town meeting that evening was standing room only, held in the church because it was the only building large enough to hold everyone who wanted their voices heard. Samuel sat in the front pew with his bandaged arm resting in his lap, feeling the weight of every stare, hearing the whispered conversations that stopped whenever he turned his head. Mayor Hutchins called for order, but it was clear from the start that order would be hard to maintain. The killing of Brennan's cattle had turned nervous concern into angry fear, and angry fear in a frontier town was a dangerous thing. 3 prize bulls, Brennan announced, standing to address the crowd. Killed. Just for sport, from the look of it. That thing didn't even eat what it killed, just tore them apart and left them for the buzzards. It's not just the cattle, called out Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher. My children are afraid to walk to school. They keep looking over their shoulders, jumping at every shadow. As they should, added Sheriff Williams, a man Samuel had known for 15 years. I've seen what big cats can do to a human being, and it's not something you want your children to stumble across. Samuel stood slowly, his injured arm sending shoots of pain up to his shoulder. Gentlemen, ladies, I understand your concerns, but there's no proof that my panther killed those cattle. It could have been a mountain lion, or even wild dogs. Wild dogs don't kill like that, Brennan shot back, and mountain lions don't plan their attacks the way someone or something planned this. What's your point, Tom? My point is that you've brought a killer into our community, and that killer is getting bolder. First it was just testing its cage, then it was killing for sport. What happens when it decides humans are more interesting prey than cattle? The room erupted in voices, some supporting Brennan, others defending Samuel's right to keep whatever animals he chose on his own land. But underneath the arguments, Samuel could hear something else, the sound of a community turning against him. Sheriff Williams raised his hand for quiet. Samuel, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and I've got nothing but respect for your family. But this situation is getting beyond what one man can handle. Maybe it's time to consider other options, such as sell it to a zoo, donate it to a university, put it down if you have to, but something's got to change before someone gets hurt. Samuel looked around the room, seeing faces he'd known all his adult life, people who'd trusted him with their cattle, their money, their respect. For the first time, he saw doubt in their eyes where there had always been confidence, fear where there had always been admiration. I'll take your concerns under consideration, he said finally, though the words tasted like ashes in his mouth. Walking home under a sky full of stars, Samuel found himself thinking about his father's advice from years ago, words that had seemed meaningless at the time, but now carried the weight of prophecy. Son, the old man had said, there's a difference between courage and stupidity, and the difference is knowing when to walk away. But walking away meant admitting he'd been wrong, meant facing the whispers that would follow him for the rest of his life. Samuel Morrison, they'd say, the man who thought he could tame the untamable and learned the hard way that some things in this world are stronger than human will. The blood-stained bandana around his arm was a constant reminder of that lesson, one written in his own blood by a creature that seemed to understand exactly what she was teaching him. As he approached his empty house, Samuel could see the glow of the panther's eyes in the darkness, watching, waiting, planning whatever came next in this deadly game between man and beast. So, Samuel's father's Winchester rifle had hung over the fireplace for 20 years, untouched except for the occasional cleaning. It was a beautiful weapon, its walnut stock worn smooth by decades of use, its steel barrel dulled to a working patina that spoke of reliability rather than show. Samuel had watched his father carry it through Indian raids, cattle rustlers, and the occasional bear that wandered down from the mountains. It had never failed to stop whatever it was aimed at. Now, in the grey light before dawn, Samuel lifted the rifle from its pegs and felt the familiar weight settle into his hands. The brass pocket watch in his vest showed 4:30, early enough that the ranch hands wouldn't be stirring, late enough that his sleepless night had stretched into something approaching madness. The walk to the panther's cage felt longer than usual, his boots crunching on frost-stiffened grass while his breath formed clouds in the cold air. The panther was awake, as she always seemed to be, watching his approach with those yellow eyes that reflected the pale starlight. She didn't move as he stopped 10 feet from the bars, didn't show any sign of concern about the rifle in his hands. Samuel raised the Winchester, feeling the familiar weight of the stock against his shoulder, the smooth trigger under his finger. At this distance, he couldn't miss. One shot, and all his problems would be over. No more town meetings, no more wounded pride, no more sleepless nights spent wondering what the creature was planning. But as he looked down the barrel at the motionless panther, Samuel found his finger frozen on the trigger. The panther stared back at him with what he could only interpret as patience, as if she understood exactly what he was contemplating and was curious to see what choice he would make. "Do it," he whispered to himself. "Just do it, and be done with it." But the seconds stretched on, and the shot never came. Finally, with hands that shook more than he cared to admit, Samuel lowered the rifle. The panther tilted her head slightly, as if acknowledging his decision, then settled back into her resting position with something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. Samuel returned to the house and hung the Winchester back over the fireplace, knowing he'd failed some crucial test but uncertain what the consequences might be. The strange incidents began the next day. Small things at first. Tools left in different places than where they'd been set down, gates opened that should have been closed, water troughs emptied despite no visible leaks. Jake mentioned them in passing, as if they were merely curiosities, rather than anything alarming. "Probably just the boys being careless," Samuel said, though even as he spoke the words he knew they rang false. "Maybe," Jake replied. "But Billy swears he left his hammer on the fence post by the south pasture, and this morning it was hanging from a tree branch 20 feet away. Pete says his rope was coiled neat as a Sunday hat when he finished with it yesterday, but today it's tied in knots he's never seen before." More disturbing was the panther's behavior during these incidents. She seemed unusually alert, her head turning to track sounds and movements that the men couldn't detect. Sometimes she would pace the length of her cage with restless energy, as if responding to signals only she could perceive. "It's like she's directing things," said Martinez, one of the younger hands, during a break from fence mending. "Like she's got helpers we can't see." "That's superstitious nonsense," Samuel replied, but he'd noticed the same pattern. The panther's agitation always preceded the discovery of moved tools or opened gates by several hours, as if she knew what was going to happen before it did. The breaking point came when Chuck Reeves, one of Samuel's most reliable hands, announced he was quitting. Chuck had worked the Morrison ranch for 8 years, had helped build half the structures on the property, and had never shown a moment's fear of any animal or situation the frontier could offer. "It's not natural, Mr. Morrison," Chuck explained, his hat in his hands and his eyes focused on something over Samuel's shoulder. "Yesterday I was working alone in the north pasture, and I could feel something watching me. Every time I looked up, there was nothing there, but the feeling never went away. When I went to get my horse, I found the saddle 20 feet from where I'd left it, and the cinch strap was tied in a bow. Nobody does that kind of work, Mr. Morrison. Nobody human." 3 more hands gave notice that same week. Good men, reliable men, all offering variations of the same story. Things moved when they shouldn't move, sounds heard where no sound should be, the constant feeling of being watched by something that was never quite visible. Samuel tried to maintain normal operations with a skeleton crew, but running a ranch the size of the Morrisons' spread required more hands than he had available. Cattle went unchecked for days at a time. Fences that needed repair stayed broken, and the general maintenance that kept a ranch functioning began to slide toward neglect. Word spread through the county that the Morrison ranch was a place to avoid, that Samuel had brought something onto his land that was affecting more than just livestock. The result was predictable. When Samuel tried to hire replacement hands, he found himself offering double wages for work that used to attract men at standard pay. The financial strain began almost immediately. The cattle that needed to be moved to winter pasture stayed where they were because Samuel lacked the manpower to drive them. Repairs that should have taken days stretched into weeks. Opportunities to buy and sell livestock were missed because Samuel couldn't leave the ranch unattended with so few men to watch it. Margaret's absence made everything worse. She'd been the one who managed the books, who remembered when bills were due and which suppliers offered the best terms. Without her organizational skills, Samuel found himself struggling with paperwork that had never seemed complicated before. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part. Samuel had spent his entire adult life surrounded by the sounds of ranch life, men calling to each other across the pastures, cattle lowing in the distance, horses nickering in the corrals. Now the ranch felt empty, haunted by sounds that didn't belong and silences that lasted too long. He tried visiting Margaret in town, but their conversations were stilted and painful. She would ask if he'd gotten rid of that creature, and when he admitted he hadn't, she would turn away with a mixture of disappointment and resignation that cut deeper than anger would have. "You're choosing that animal over your family, Samuel," she said during one particularly difficult visit, "and I don't understand why." Samuel couldn't explain it because he didn't understand it himself. All he knew was that shooting the panther felt like surrender, like admitting that Samuel Morrison wasn't strong enough or smart enough to master the situation he'd created. His pride wouldn't let him take that step, even as it cost him everything else. The panther, meanwhile, seemed to thrive on the chaos she'd created. She appeared healthier than ever, her coat glossy black, her movements fluid and confident. Sometimes, Samuel caught her watching the empty bunkhouse where his hands used to sleep, and he could swear she looked pleased by the desertion. Late at night, when the ranch was quiet except for the wind through the eaves, Samuel would stand at his bedroom window and stare out at the panther's cage. More often than not, she would be staring back, her yellow eyes glowing in the darkness like twin lanterns. The sight should have been comforting, proof that she was still contained, still under his control, but instead it filled him with a creeping unease that made sleep impossible. The Winchester rifle hanging over his fireplace seemed to mock him with its unused potential. Every morning he considered taking it down again, and every morning he found a reason to delay. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he would end this madness and reclaim his life. But tomorrow never seemed to come, and the yellow eyes continued to watch from the darkness, patient as death and twice as certain. The discovery came by accident, as the most important discoveries often do. Samuel had been searching through the storage room above the barn, looking for winter blankets to replace the ones that had mysteriously disappeared from the bunkhouse, when his foot went through a loose board in the floor. Cursing as he pulled, his boot free, he noticed something wedged between the joists, a leather-wrapped bundle that had been deliberately hidden beneath the floorboards. The bundle contained a journal, its leather cover cracked with age, and its pages yellowed by time and dampness. The handwriting inside was careful and precise, written in Spanish by someone with educated hands. Samuel's knowledge of the language was limited, picked up from dealings with vaqueros and traders over the years, but he could make out enough to understand that this was the record of a man's final months of life. The name on the first page made Samuel's blood run cold. Don Carlos Mendoza, Hacienda de la Luna Negra, Sonora, Mexico. The date was 18 months ago. Samuel carried the journal down from the storage room and spread it on the kitchen table, using a Spanish-English dictionary he'd acquired years ago to translate the entries. What he read made his hands shake and his mouth go dry with understanding of exactly what he'd brought onto his land. The first entries were mundane enough: records of cattle purchases, notes about the weather, mentions of family celebrations. But as Samuel read deeper, a darker pattern emerged. Don Carlos had acquired a panther, purchased from a traveling trader for what the journal called a price that seemed too good to be true, a single silver peso. Samuel's throat tightened as he read on. The similarities were unmistakable. The trader had appeared in the town square with a caged panther, had claimed it was captured in the mountains after killing several men, had allowed the bidding to proceed. Until Don Carlos stepped forward with his single coin and declared he would take the dangerous one. But there the similarities ended, and the real horror began. Don Carlos had been a wealthy man, owner of thousands of acres and hundreds of cattle. He'd been known throughout Sonora for his pride, his refusal to back down from any challenge, his absolute confidence that money and will could overcome any obstacle. The Panther had become his obsession, just as it had become Samuel's. The journal entries grew increasingly disturbed as the weeks passed. The Panther had escaped repeatedly, killing livestock and terrifying the hacienda's workers. Don Carlos had lost most of his vaqueros to fear and superstition, just as Samuel had lost his ranch hands. The Panther had demonstrated an uncanny intelligence, seeming to understand human behavior and exploit it for her own purposes. But it was the later entries that made Samuel's blood turn to ice water. October 15th. I understand now that the Panther is not trying to escape. She is hunting, not cattle, not livestock, but something far more dangerous. She is hunting me, learning my habits, my weaknesses, my routines. The trader lied about everything. This creature was not captured in the wild. She was trained. Samuel's hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn the pages, but he forced himself to continue reading. October 20th, found evidence in the ruins of the old mission. Previous owners' belongings, including papers that tell the true story. The Panther has had at least 4 owners before me, all wealthy men, all proud men, all dead. The trader sells her for a token amount to men whose pride won't let them refuse a challenge. She kills them one by one, and the trader reclaims her to sell again. I am not her master, I am her next victim. October 25th. Attempted to shoot the beast, but found I could not pull the trigger. There is something in her eyes, something that speaks to the darkness in my own soul. She knows I am trapped by my pride, knows I cannot admit defeat, knows I would rather die than confess I was wrong. She is patient because she knows time is on her side. November 2nd. The attacks on the livestock have stopped. She no longer needs to terrorize my workers or destroy my property. She has achieved her real goal. She has isolated me completely. Now she waits for the final act, when pride drives me to some fatal mistake. I see now why the trader smiled. When I placed my peso on his wagon, he knew exactly what would happen. The final entry was dated November 8th, written in a hand that shook with fear or illness or both. She got out again last night, but this time she came to the house, found her tracks on the veranda, smears on the windows where she pressed her face against the glass. She was studying the interior, memorizing the layout, planning her final approach. I know now that I will not live to see December. The pride that made me take her will be the pride that kills me. If anyone finds this journal, know that the Panther is not an animal. She is a weapon, carefully crafted to destroy men like us. The trader's name is Ezra Flint, and he has been selling death for a silver coin to proud fools across the frontier. Beware. Samuel sat in the gathering dusk, staring at the journal's final page, where Don Carlos had attempted to write something else, but had apparently been interrupted. The ink trailed off in a jagged line, as if the pen had been knocked from his hand. Search through the rest of the bundle revealed a collection of newspaper clippings that Don Carlos had gathered, all reporting the mysterious deaths of wealthy ranchers and landowners across Texas, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. The pattern was always the same. A successful man would acquire an exotic animal, become obsessed with training it, lose his workers and family to fear, then die under mysterious circumstances. The animal would disappear, only to surface weeks later in another town, another sale, another prideful man stepping forward with a single coin. Samuel counted 7 different men whose deaths followed the pattern, spanning 3 years and covering hundreds of miles. 7 men who had thought they could master the untrainable, who had let their pride lead them into a trap that closed around them like steel jaws. The most chilling discovery was a daguerreotype tucked between the journal's pages, a formal portrait of Don Carlos Mendoza and his family. The resemblance between Don Carlos and Samuel was unmistakable. Both men in their 40s, both with the bearing of successful ranchers, both with the kind of confidence that came from never having met a challenge they couldn't overcome. It was as if Ezra Flint had been seeking out a specific type of man. a particular combination of pride and wealth and stubborn determination. Samuel realized now why Flint had seemed so confident during the auction, why he'd accepted the single silver dollar without argument. The trader hadn't been selling a panther. He'd been setting a trap for exactly the kind of man Samuel Morrison was. The creature in the cage wasn't some wild animal driven by instinct. She was a carefully trained killer, shaped and honed by whatever dark methods Flint employed to create the perfect weapon against male pride. The brass pocket watch ticked in Samuel's vest, counting down the time until the panther completed her deadly work. He understood now that every moment since the auction had been choreographed, from the escape attempts that demonstrated her intelligence to the livestock killings that isolated him from his community. She wasn't trying to get away. She was maneuvering him into the exact position where his pride would force him to make the fatal mistake she was waiting for. Samuel thought about the Winchester rifle hanging over his fireplace, about his inability to pull the trigger that morning. Had that been his own weakness, or had the panther somehow influenced his decision? Did it matter? The result was the same. He was trapped by the same pride that had killed 7 other men, caught in a web that tightened with every passing day. Outside, the panther called softly in the darkness, a sound that no longer seemed like animal communication, but like a countdown to something inevitable. Samuel understood now that Ezra Flint was probably long gone, having completed his sale and moved on to find his next victim. The trader would return only when the panther had finished her work, ready to reclaim his weapon and begin the cycle. Again, with another proud fool in another town, Samuel Morrison had bought more than he'd bargained for with his silver dollar. He'd bought a professionally crafted death sentence, one that came with yellow eyes and infinite patience, and the absolute certainty that pride would eventually drive him to exactly the mistake she was waiting for. The plan came to Samuel in the darkest hour of night, when the weight of Don Carlos's journal pressed on his chest like a gravestone, and the yellow eyes in the darkness seemed to mock his every breath. If the panther was a weapon designed to kill him on his own land, surrounded by the remnants of his pride and the expectations of his community, then the solution was simple: remove her from that environment entirely. He would transport the panther deep into the wilderness, far from Amarillo, far from witnesses, far from everything that represented Samuel Morrison's reputation and status. There, in the empty places where no one would ever know what happened, he would face the creature on equal terms and end this nightmare one way or another. The logistics were staggering. The iron cage weighed nearly 2 tons when empty and moving. It required specialized equipment that Samuel would have to design and build himself. He spent 3 sleepless days sketching plans for a transport system, measuring weights, and calculating the strength requirements for axles, wheels, and hitching systems that could handle such a massive load. The cage itself would need modifications. The panther had already proven that the existing locks were merely suggestions she chose to honor. For the journey, Samuel designed a system of heavy iron chains that would secure every opening, every weak point, every possible avenue of escape. He ordered the chains from the blacksmith in Amarillo, specifying links thick enough to anchor a steamship and asking no questions about why Samuel Morrison needed enough iron to build a bridge. The chains arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by wagon because their weight exceeded what any single horse could carry. Each link was forged from steel as thick as Samuel's thumb, connected by pins that required special tools to install and remove. The sight of them piled beside the panther's cage should have been reassuring, but instead Samuel felt like he was looking at his own burial preparations. Jake found him that afternoon, welding additional attachment points to the cage where the chains would connect. The foreman had been scarce since the revelation about the journal, spending his time in town or working the far pastures where the panther's influence seemed less oppressive. But something in Samuel's demeanor must have called him back. Some Recognition that his boss was approaching the final act of this deadly drama. "Samuel," Jake said quietly, watching sparks fly from the welding torch, "what are you planning?" Samuel finished the weld before answering, pulling off his protective mask and wiping sweat from his face. "I'm going to take her away from here. Far enough that whatever happens won't hurt anyone else. And then what? Then I'm going to end this, one way or another." Jake studied the massive chains, the reinforced cage, the mobile platform Samuel had constructed to transport it all. "This isn't about the Panther anymore, is it? This is about you and that trader, about not letting him win." "Maybe," Samuel admitted. "But what's the alternative? Shoot her in her cage like a dog? Let the town council come and do it for me? Live the rest of my life knowing I was beaten by a traveling con man and his trained killer? You could walk away, sell the ranch, take Margaret somewhere far from here, start over." Samuel's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You think she'd want me back after this? You think any of this just goes away if I run?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying his boss with eyes that had seen 40 years of frontier life and all the pride and folly that came with it. Finally, he nodded slowly. "When do we leave?" "We? You think I'm letting you do this alone? After 23 years working for your family?" Jake spat into the dust and adjusted his hat. "Besides, somebody needs to be there to tell Margaret. What happened when this is over?" The preparations took another week. Samuel hired a specialty wagon from the railroad, designed for moving heavy machinery, and modified it to carry the caged Panther. The transport route would take them northwest into the empty lands beyond the Palo Duro Canyon, where the nearest settlement was more than 50 miles away, and the landscape was too rough for anyone to follow without serious purpose. Margaret came out to the ranch on the evening before departure, drawn by news that had filtered through the town's gossip network. Samuel found her standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the cage where the Panther waited, with what seemed like eager anticipation. "So you're really going to do this?" she said without turning around. "I have to, Margaret. You read the journal. You know what she is, what Flint created her to do. This is the only way to break the cycle." Margaret turned to face him, and Samuel was shocked by how much older she looked. The past weeks had carved lines around her eyes and mouth, had stolen the color from her cheeks and the light from her smile. "And if you don't come back, then at least it ends with me. No other proud fool will buy her for a silver dollar." "There are other proud fools, Samuel. There will always be other proud fools." Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she folded a dish towel with unnecessary precision. "The question is whether one of them has to be my husband." Samuel moved to embrace her, but she stepped back, maintaining the distance that had grown between them like a chasm. "I used to think your pride was one of the things I loved about you," she said quietly. "The way you'd never back down. Never admit defeat. Never let anyone or anything get the better of Samuel Morrison. But now I see what that pride really costs, and the price is too high." "Margaret, no, let me finish. If you come back from this, if you somehow survive whatever that creature has planned for you, things have to change. I won't live with a man who values his reputation more than his family, who would rather die than admit he made a mistake." The words hit Samuel harder than the Panther's claws ever had. "And if I can't change?" Margaret's smile was sad as autumn rain. "Then I guess we'll both know where we stand." She left without saying goodbye, walking to her buggy with the straight-backed dignity that had first attracted Samuel 20 years ago. He watched her drive away, wondering if he was seeing his wife for the last time and whether his pride would let him call out to stop her. The departure was scheduled for midnight when the roads would be empty and the chances of witnesses minimal. Samuel and Jake spent the evening making final preparations, checking the chains one last time, testing the wagon's suspension, ensuring that every component of their dangerous cargo would hold together for the long journey ahead. The Panther seemed to understand that something significant was happening. She paced her cage with restless energy, her yellow eyes bright with what looked disturbingly like excitement. When Samuel approached to secure the transport chains, she positioned herself at the front of the cage, watching his every movement with the intensity of a general observing enemy troop movements. "She knows," Jake muttered, tightening the hitching straps that connected the mobile cage to their wagon team. "Look at her, Samuel. She's not concerned about where we're taking her. She's pleased about it." Samuel wrapped the heavy iron chains around the cage's locking mechanisms, each link settling into place with a sound like closing coffin nails. The chains were proof against any strength he could imagine, designed to hold even if the Panther somehow managed to break free from her cage's interior restraints. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was decorating a trap rather than building one. The wagon train that finally departed the Morrison ranch consisted of 3 vehicles: the heavy transport carrying the caged Panther, a supply wagon with food and camping equipment, and Samuel's personal buggy carrying weapons and emergency gear. 8 horses pulled the primary load, their breath steaming in the cold night air as they leaned into the massive weight behind them. As they rolled through the gates of his property, Samuel looked back once at the ranch house where he'd lived for 15 years, where he'd built his fortune and reputation and marriage. In the darkness, it looked smaller than he remembered, less substantial, as if it might blow away in a strong wind. The Panther traveled in silence for the first hour, but as they moved deeper into the empty country beyond Amarillo, she began to vocalize low, rumbling sounds that seemed almost like purring, but carried an undertone that made the horses nervous, and the dogs that had followed them from town turned back toward civilization. "She's talking to something," Jake observed, glancing back at the caged creature. But what? Samuel had been wondering the same thing. The Panther's vocalizations had a rhythm to them, almost like a conversation, as if she was reporting their progress to some unseen listener. The idea was absurd, but then again, everything about this situation had moved beyond the realm of normal animal behavior. 20 miles from town, the first technical problem arose. One of the wagon's axles began to smoke from the strain of the massive load, forcing them to stop and inspect the damage. The axle wasn't broken, but the bearing was overheating in a way that could lead to catastrophic failure if they continued without repairs. As Samuel and Jake worked by lantern light to repack the bearing with grease, the Panther's behavior changed dramatically. Her vocalizations increased in frequency and urgency, and she began moving around her cage with agitated energy. It was as if she sensed that the delay presented some kind of opportunity. "We need to get moving," Jake said, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "I don't like how she's acting." Samuel nodded, though privately he wondered if it mattered. Every mile they traveled seemed to be taking them deeper into a trap rather than away from one. The heavy chains that should have made him feel secure instead felt like bonds connecting him to his own destruction. As they resumed their journey into the darkness, the Panther settled back into her watching position, but her yellow eyes remained fixed on Samuel with an intensity that suggested the real journey was just beginning. The catastrophic failure came at dawn, in a narrow canyon where the wagon road twisted between walls of red sandstone. Samuel would later think that the timing and location were no accident. The Panther had somehow known this was where the transport would be most vulnerable, where help was impossible and escape routes were limited. The sound started as a low grinding from the wagon's undercarriage, metal against metal with a rhythm that spoke of something fundamental coming apart. Samuel called for a halt, but before the horses could fully stop, the modified axle assembly gave way with a crack like breaking thunder. The wagon lurched sideways, its massive cargo shifting with enough force to snap the restraining chains like twine. The iron cage, which had seemed indestructible just hours before, struck the canyon wall and split open along a welded seam that couldn't handle the impact. For a moment that lasted forever, Samuel stared at the twisted metal and broken chains, understanding that every precaution he'd taken had just become meaningless. The Panther stepped delicately through the wreckage, shaking dust from her midnight coat like a lady adjusting her dress after a carriage ride. She showed no sign of injury, despite the violent crash, no indication of stress or fear. If anything, she looked pleased, as if events were finally proceeding according to her own design. "Jesus," Jake breathed, reaching for the rifle secured beside the driver's seat. The Panther's head turned toward the sound, yellow eyes locking onto Jake with predatory focus. She didn't crouch or bare her teeth or show any of the aggressive postures Samuel had expected. Instead, she simply stood there, studying them with the patient attention of a chess master considering her next move. Samuel's hand found the handle of his father's cattle whip, the braided leather familiar and comforting in his grip. The whip had been hanging from his belt since they'd left the ranch, more from habit than any real belief it would be useful against a creature like the Panther. Now, with 30 feet of open ground between him and death, it was the only weapon within reach. "Easy, girl," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Easy now." The Panther tilted her head at the sound of his voice, and Samuel could swear he saw amusement in those yellow eyes. She understood that he was trying to calm her, understood the futility of it, understood that this moment had been inevitable since the day he'd placed his silver dollar on Ezra Flint's wagon. Jake's rifle blast shattered the canyon's silence, the bullet sparking off rock where the Panther had been standing a split second before. She moved like liquid shadow, flowing across the uneven ground with a grace that made human movement look clumsy by comparison. The shot had been perfectly aimed, would have killed any normal animal, but the Panther had begun moving before. Jake's finger touched the trigger, as if she'd read his intentions in his body language. Samuel cracked the whip, the leather's snap echoing off the canyon walls like a gunshot. The Panther paused, not from fear but from curiosity, watching the leather writhe through the air like a snake. When Samuel cracked it again, she took a single step forward, closing the distance between them with deliberate precision. "The horses!" Jake called out, working the bolt of his rifle. "We need to get to the horses." But the Panther had positioned herself between them and their mounts, cutting off the most obvious escape route. The horses, sensing predator, were already backing away with rolled eyes and flared nostrils, their training warring with their instinct to flee. Samuel tried to move laterally, using the whip to keep space between himself and the Panther, but she mirrored his movements with fluid precision. Every step he took, she took one to match it, maintaining the exact distance that kept him within her striking range while staying just beyond the reach of his weapon. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She was herding him, not attacking, not attempting to kill him outright, but maneuvering him into position for something else. The broken wagon, the narrow canyon, even the timing of the axle failure, all of it had been orchestrated to bring them to this moment, this place, this exact configuration of predator and prey. Jake's second shot went wide as the Panther suddenly accelerated, not toward Samuel but toward the rifleman himself. Jake stumbled backward, trying to work the bolt while keeping the weapon between himself and 200 pounds of apex predator. The collision, when it came, was brief but decisive. Samuel heard Jake scream, a sound that would haunt his dreams if he lived long enough to have them, and saw his friend go down in a tangle of claws and rifle and desperate human limbs. When the Panther stepped back, Jake was clutching his shoulder with hands that came away red, and the rifle lay in pieces where it had struck the canyon wall. "Jake!" Samuel started forward, the whip raised to strike, but stopped when the Panther's gaze fixed on him with unmistakable warning. The message was clear. The injured man lived only as long as Samuel made no aggressive moves. "I'm all right," Jake gasped, though his face was white with pain and shock, shoulders torn up. "But I'm all right." The Panther settled into a crouch between the two men, close enough to reach either one with a single leap, but showing no immediate intention to do so. She was waiting for something, Samuel realized, some action or decision that would trigger the next phase of whatever game she was playing. Samuel's father's whip felt heavy in his hand. its braided leather handle worn smooth by decades of use. The old man had carried this whip through every challenge the frontier could offer, had used it to drive cattle, break horses, and defend his family from dangers both animal and human. It had never failed him. But as Samuel looked into the Panther's yellow eyes, seeing intelligence that seemed almost human in its complexity, he understood that this wasn't the kind of challenge his father had ever faced. This wasn't about animal behavior or frontier skills or the simple dominance of man over beast. This was about pride and patience and the deadly game that began when a wealthy man convinced himself he could own something that was never meant to be owned. The whip handle creaked in Samuel's grip as he tightened his hold, leather wrapping that had comforted 3 generations of Morrison men. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the horses moving further away, spooked by the scent of blood and predator. Soon, it would be just him, the injured Jake, and a killer that had been trained to exploit everything human pride could devise. The Panther's tail twitched once, a subtle movement that might have been annoyance or anticipation. Then she rose from her crouch and began to pace, her yellow eyes never leaving Samuel's face, waiting for him to make the move that would determine whether this game ended quickly or whether she would have the opportunity to demonstrate just how thoroughly Ezra Flint had trained her. The standoff lasted until the sun reached its peak, heat reflecting off the canyon walls and turning the narrow space into a furnace. Samuel's shirt was soaked with sweat, his grip on the whip handle slippery despite the familiar leather wrapping. Jake had managed to stop the bleeding from his shoulder, but his face remained pale and his movements careful. The Panther showed no signs of discomfort from the heat. She moved in and out of the shadows with liquid grace, sometimes disappearing entirely behind rock formations, only to reappear in a different position, always maintaining her tactical advantage. It was clear she could have attacked at any time, could have ended this confrontation whenever she chose. Instead, she seemed to be waiting for Samuel to understand something fundamental about their situation. The revelation came when Samuel noticed what he'd been too stressed to see before. A leather collar around the Panther's neck, nearly invisible against her black coat, but revealed when the sunlight hit it at the right angle. The collar was fitted with metal studs and a small metal plate that caught the light, some kind of identification or marking that spoke of ownership, training, control. "Son of a bitch," Samuel breathed, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You're still wearing his collar." The Panther's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, and she moved closer, stopping just beyond the reach of his whip. For the first time since her escape, she wasn't positioning herself for attack or defense. She was presenting herself, allowing him to see the collar clearly, letting him understand what it represented. Samuel thought about Don Carlos's journal, about the 7 men who had died thinking they could master this creature. None of them had understood what he was beginning to see now. The Panther wasn't rebelling against human authority. She was enslaved by it. The collar represented her bondage to Ezra Flint's twisted training, the conditioning that forced her to kill anyone who tried to claim ownership of her. "Jake," Samuel said quietly, not taking his eyes off the Panther, "I need to get close enough to remove her collar." "Are you out of your mind?" Jake's voice was weak but incredulous. "Samuel, that thing will tear you apart." "No, she won't." "Look at her eyes, Jake. She's not hunting anymore. She's asking for help." It was true. The predatory focus had gone out of the Panther's gaze, replaced by something that looked almost like pleading. She knew what the collar represented, knew what it forced her to do, and she was tired of being Ezra Flint's weapon of pride and destruction. Samuel began to move forward, one careful step at a time, the whip held loose in his hand, but not raised to strike. The Panther watched his approach without retreating, her yellow eyes locked on his with an intensity that spoke of desperate hope. "Easy, girl," Samuel murmured, the same words he'd used to calm countless horses and cattle over the years. "Nobody's going to own you anymore. Nobody's going to make you into something you're not." When he was close enough to touch her, The panther lowered her head slightly, exposing the collar's buckle mechanism. The metal was warm from the sun and intricate in its design, clearly crafted by someone who understood both leatherwork and animal psychology. Samuel could see how the collar's weight and pressure would create constant discomfort, a physical reminder of servitude that would drive any intelligent creature to rebellion. The buckle was designed to be difficult to remove, requiring manipulation of several small levers in a specific sequence. As Samuel worked his hands inches from fangs that could sever his wrist, he felt the panther's breathing, slow and steady, as if she was deliberately keeping herself calm through an act of tremendous will. "That's it," Samuel whispered as the first lever clicked open. Almost there. The second lever was trickier, requiring him to work blind while maintaining his balance. The panther remained motionless, but Samuel could feel the tension in her muscles, the coiled energy that spoke of how much effort it took for her to remain passive while human hands worked around her throat. The final lever opened with a soft click, and the collar fell away to land in the dust at Samuel's feet. The panther stepped back immediately, shaking herself as if casting off more than just a piece of leather and metal. The relief in her posture was unmistakable, shoulders settling, head lifting, the predatory crouch giving way to something that looked almost regal. For a long moment, man and panther regarded each other in the canyon's heat. Samuel saw intelligence in those yellow eyes, gratitude, and something else that might have been respect. Not the forced submission that Flint had trained into her, but the acknowledgement of one free creature recognizing another. "Go on," Samuel said softly. "You're free now." The panther turned and walked toward the canyon's far end, her movements flowing like water over stone. At the canyon's mouth, she paused and looked back once, her gaze meeting Samuel's across the distance. Then she was gone, disappearing into the wilderness where she belonged, where no man's pride could ever claim her again. Samuel picked up the discarded collar, feeling its weight and the cruelty of its design. The metal plate bore an inscription. In Spanish, Propiedad de Ezra Flint, Instrument of Justice. Property of Ezra Flint, Instrument of Justice. The trader's perverted sense of righteousness was engraved in metal, his belief that he was somehow serving justice by destroying prideful men. "Samuel," Jake called weakly from where he sat against the canyon wall. "We need to get out of here. My shoulder's not getting any better, and we've got a long walk ahead of us." Samuel tucked the collar into his jacket and helped Jake to his feet. The return journey would be difficult. Jake's injury limited his mobility, and they had no horses, no supplies, no shelter, except what they could improvise from the wreckage of their expedition. But as they began the long walk back toward civilization, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. The weight that had pressed on his chest since the day he'd bought the Panther was gone, replaced by a clarity that made every step feel lighter, despite the physical challenges ahead. "You did the right thing," Jake said after they'd walked in silence for an hour. "Took me long enough to figure out what the right thing was. Pride's a hell of a thing, Samuel. Makes smart men stupid and strong men weak." Samuel nodded, thinking about the brass pocket watch in his vest, about his grandfather's inscription, about time showing a man what he's made of. He understood now that strength wasn't about dominating everything around you. It was about knowing when to let go, when to admit you'd been wrong, when to choose humility over the comfortable fiction of control. The Panther's collar rested against his ribs as they walked, a reminder of the price of thinking any creature, human or animal, could be owned, controlled, or reduced to an instrument of someone else's will. Somewhere behind them in the canyon, the broken chains and twisted metal testified to the futility of trying to contain what was meant to be free. Samuel Morrison was walking home a different man than the one who had left his ranch in chains and pride. The Panther had taught him the most important lesson of his life, and the teaching had cost him everything except what truly mattered. Cool. Samuel and Jake reached Amarillo 3 days later, sunburned and exhausted, their clothes torn, and their faces marked by the kind of ordeal that changes a man from the inside out. Word of their return spread quickly through the town, along with the news that they'd returned without the Panther, without explanation, and without the arrogant confidence that had characterized Samuel Morrison for as long as anyone could remember. Margaret was waiting on the porch of her sister's house when Samuel walked up the dusty street, his steps careful and deliberate, his shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. She'd heard he was back. News traveled fast in a town the size of Amarillo. But seeing him approach, she barely recognized the man she'd married. Gone was the unconscious swagger that had marked his walk since boyhood, the set of his jaw that had always suggested he was ready to take on the world and confident of winning. In its place was something quieter, more thoughtful, as if the man walking toward her had learned to listen to voices he'd never bothered to hear before. "Margaret," Samuel said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps and looking up at his wife, with eyes that held no expectation, no demand for forgiveness or understanding. "I came to apologize." She studied his face, seeing lines that hadn't been there a week ago, a gravity in his expression that spoke of more than just physical hardship. "What happened out there, Samuel?" "I learned what I was made of," he said, simply, "and I didn't much like what I found." They talked on that porch until the sun went down and the evening stars appeared. Samuel telling the story of the canyon, the collar, and the choice he'd made to free rather than kill. Margaret listened without interruption, watching her husband's face in the lamplight, seeing honesty where there had always been justification, humility where there had always been pride. "The Panther's gone?" she asked when he finished. "Gone. Back to where she belongs, where she was always meant to be." "And Ezra Flint?" Samuel pulled the leather collar from his jacket, setting it on the porch railing between them. "Still out there somewhere, looking for the next proud fool with a silver dollar, but he won't find one in Samuel Morrison." Margaret reached out and touched the collar, feeling the weight of it, the cruelty embedded in its design. "What now, Samuel? What do we do now?" "We start over," Samuel said. "Different this time. Better." The conversation that followed was the most honest they'd ever had, laying bare the pride and fear and stubborn mistakes that had brought them to this moment. Samuel admitted that his need to prove himself had nearly cost him everything that mattered, while Margaret acknowledged her own role in enabling his recklessness by never forcing him to face the consequences of his choices. "I can't be the man I was, Margaret," Samuel said as the night deepened around them. "That man nearly got me killed and cost us everything we'd built together. But I don't know yet who I'm supposed to be instead. Then we'll figure it out together," Margaret said, taking his hand for the first time in weeks, one day at a time. The next morning brought the hardest decision of Samuel's life, selling the Morrison Ranch. The land his family had worked for 3 generations, the legacy his father had died protecting, the foundation of everything he'd thought defined him as a man. All of it had to go, but the decision felt right in a way that surprised him. The ranch had become a symbol of his pride, and that pride had nearly destroyed him. Better to let it go while he still could, while there was time to build something new and better in its place. The sale proceeds went first to compensation for the families affected by his Panther. Tom Brennan received payment for his slaughtered cattle. The ranch hands who'd quit in fear got the wages he owed them plus extra for their troubles, and the town received a donation to hire additional security for the peace of mind his foolishness had cost them. Samuel and Margaret used what remained to buy a small farm 40 miles south of Amarillo, in a county where the Morrison name carried no expectations, and Samuel's reputation was a blank slate waiting to be written. The farmhouse was modest compared to their former home, the land measured in hundreds of acres rather than thousands, but it felt like a sanctuary after the poisoned grandeur of the ranch. Years passed quietly. Samuel learned to farm cotton and raise a few head of cattle, discovering satisfaction in work that served practical purposes rather than proving points. Margaret opened a small school for local children, finding joy in nurturing young minds rather than managing the social obligations that had consumed her time as a wealthy rancher's wife. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl who grew up knowing their father as a gentleman who worked hard and spoke honestly, who treated animals with respect and neighbors with kindness. Samuel never told them about the panther, though sometimes Margaret would catch him staring out at the horizon with a distant look that spoke of lessons learned in ways too dangerous to share. On Samuel's 50th birthday, Margaret surprised him with a gift that brought tears to his eyes. A photograph of their family, taken by a traveling photographer, showing Samuel and Margaret with their children on the porch of their simple farmhouse. In the picture, Samuel's face was weathered by sun and honest work, his smile genuine and unforced, his eyes clear of the desperate need to prove himself that had once driven him to the edge of destruction. "For your study," Margaret said, watching him examine the photograph, "to remember what's really worth fighting for." Samuel hung the picture on the wall above his desk, where he could see it every morning when he reviewed the farm's accounts, and planned the day's work. Below it, in the desk's bottom drawer, lay a single silver dollar, the same coin he'd placed on Ezra Flint's wagon so many years ago. He'd found it in his pocket after returning from the canyon, and had kept it as a reminder of the price of pride. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and his family slept safely in their beds, Samuel would take out the coin and hold it up to the lamplight, remembering the weight of the choice it represented. The silver dollar had bought him more than a panther. It had bought him the most important lesson of his life, that a man's true worth wasn't measured by what he could dominate or control, but by what he could protect, nurture, and set free. It had taken him 40 years and a trained killer to learn that lesson, but Samuel Morrison had finally discovered what his grandfather's inscription really meant. Time had indeed shown him what he was made of, not the unyielding pride he'd thought was strength, but the courage to admit when he was wrong, the wisdom to choose love over reputation, and the humility to find satisfaction in a life measured by quiet contentment rather than public acclaim. The faded photograph smiled down at him from the wall, showing a man who had learned that the most dangerous creatures in the world weren't the ones with claws and fangs, but the ones who convinced you that your pride was worth more than your soul.